why don't you explain how you got into the study of Aboriginal seafaring, their coastal craft, maritime rock art, their depictions of foreign ships? There's so much wonderful material here. How did you first get into it?
Well, the first wreck inspector for the museum, Scott Sledge, took a group of people to the Kimberley to look for shipwrecks up there. And while he was there, he was in the company of a wonderful anthropologist, Ian Crawford, sometimes, who spent a lot of time with the Aboriginal people, one of the earliest recorders of the Wandjina art, the famous 5,000-year-old art. And Scott got to know a lot of the Aboriginal informants. And while he was looking for the wrecks of pearling luggers and sailing ships and steamers, he was told of rock art at various places in the Kimberley. And he went to a place called Biggie Island, where there are some of the earliest known depictions of European-type vessels in the Kimberley. Now, so it was sort of part of our tradition as wreck inspectors to look more broadly than the shipwreck underwater. And when I was working on the SS Xantho, a ship, interestingly, that was built over in Scotland and ended up sinking out here with a Crimean War gunboat engine in it, which led to all sorts of strange questions. It led me to the study of Aboriginal people in pearling. And this led us to realise that we needed to know a lot more about the Aboriginal people who seem to have interacted on this ship, the Xantho, with the people from the islands north of Australia called Malays. And in fact, this chap Broadhurst was involved when the Aboriginal people were doing what we call naked diving. No mask, no fins, no snorkel, nothing, but still being immensely successful. And so it led into a need to find more about them, and it led us to a picture, would you believe, 300 miles inland at a place called Walga Rock or Walgana, near a mining town of Mcarthy, that some people thought may be Xantho. A student of Aboriginal art in 1987 first suggested that. So we decided to look into it more, and I ended up being given a student, Leslie Sylvester, from one of the heritage universities, and I asked her if she would start studying every known example when Aboriginal people mixed with European people from ships and shipwrecks and stuff. And Leslie did this extraordinary job. And we called it Strangers on the Shore because it was concentrating on people who were wrecked in the end. And Ackerbilk's famous song was in there. And she did an amazing job and catalogued all of the known times that there was interactions with Aboriginal people and shipwreck survivors, and also their involvement with the Xantho, my key interest at the time.
So let's just, the Xantho, that's 1870s or so, am I right there?
That's right, yeah. Well, it's actually, would you believe, built in the same year as Great Britain, one of the earliest steamers ever made, built as a ferry for working in Ainster, or as us Australians would say, Anstruther, in Scotland, and ended up coming out here worn out and had this Crimean War gunboat engine put in it and came out here and sank within 6 months.
And that's just one example of Europeans interacting with their Aboriginal peoples.
Yes, and importantly here, they're interacting with them in the pearling industry. And the Aboriginal people are diving for pearls without any equipment. And Broadhurst brings over what we call Malays or divers from the Indies, who all proved to be far less able than the Aboriginal people. And he also introduced the hard hat to pearling. So we've got these enormous themes going through. And for a wreck inspector, this is really good fun because all of these led to all sorts of shipwrecks, all this activity of all various types. And Leslie then produced this catalogue, which is on the web. And then the next thing that happened is that we realised that she was also finding that there was some Indigenous depictions of these ships in her studies. And this led to another one of my students, a chap called Nicolas Bigourdin, Nicolas Bigourdin, if to be properly French, even though I destroyed the French language. And Nicolas was one of my students, and he started to collate all the known instances of ship or boat depictions by Aboriginal people right throughout Western Australia. So we had these two students working with me, Leslie working in 1998, and then Nicholas in 2006, doing this wonderful catalogue. And I think it's one of the first times in Australia, well, it was the first time in Australia these things were happening. And they produced this catalogue which led my department and myself into the study of Indigenous watercraft depictions and Indigenous contact shipwrecks and so on. And at the time it was paralleling other people's interests, which was more towards the traditional rock art, not so much the Indigenous depictions of watercraft. And so that eventually led to an efflorescence of interest by more scholars than I can point a stick at now, in terms of not just the number, but their intellect and their ability to analyse, such that now there's many people in Australia studying Aboriginal rock art and depictions of maritime rock art. It's just extraordinary now, Sam.
How many examples did you find with the initial research into this? I mean, are we talking about 10 or are there more?
One of the leading scholars, Paul Tayson, over here in Australia, he said that Australia has more rock paintings of non-Indigenous watercraft than any other country, with several hundred scattered around the coastline and some at sites as much as a couple of 100 kilometres inland. Particularly large concentrations can be found in parts of northern Queensland, on Groote Island, in Western Arnhem Land, but there are smaller clusters in the Kimberley and Pilbara of Western Australia. Drawn and engraved ships can also be seen scattered across the Greater Sydney region into the Blue Mountains. And he then looks at the many types. And as I say, there's about 30 or 40 of his colleagues now very busy researching and writing. But they can be identified as vessels of Southeast Asian origin. Macassans, wonderful groups coming looking for the Bêche de Mer. And the first... Okay. They're in the 18th century, a very big trade. They would come across here in the northwest monsoon, stay here for 6 months and go back home in the southeast trades. And they'd take Aboriginal people with them, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. And you can imagine the effect this had on the people who did an awful lot of recording in rock art. I mean, you look at Murajuga, apparently millions of engravings there over the years. Well, Aboriginal people took to drawing these ships of these people, the Europeans, the Macassans, in great numbers. And it really goes back to a long, long way. And the earliest known image that has been found is apparently dating back to around about the 1660s, which predates the Macassans, who are more a 1700s phenomenon.
Okay, so we thinking about the Dutch in the 1660s?
No. Interestingly, the Dutch don't feature down in our area very much at all. There's more work being done. But one of the things that did happen to me was that they thought that one of the images I was dealing with, which is the one at Walga Rock, 300 miles inland in this mining town, was Zoutdorp or was the Batavia, the famous Batavia. So, there has been a lot of interest in them possibly being Dutch, but they're not.